Just wanted to welcome all of you to the first session of Doing Business in China webinar series with Doug Guthrie. I'm Megan Lillick, and I'll be your host tonight from the Berlin School. And if you have any questions, technical issues, what be it, use the chat window. You can write me a direct mail message. Also simple housekeeping, just keep the mics muted during the presentation, and at the very end, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Doug Guthrie.
Thank you so much, Megan. And it's really wonderful to be here with you all. I was just mentioning to Giovanna that this feels like a little bit of a homecoming for me because David and I got involved with the Berlin School in the early days of the school and helped the founders of the school imagine what an executive MBA academic curriculum should look like and what it would be to think about creative leadership. And so it was really, when I think back about all the things I've done in my career, it's really one of the points of passion. And so being able to come back here now and be working with David and Craig Marcus, who's an alum of the Berlin School, to just help the Berlin School reimagine itself in this moment, which is a little crazy for all of us, is a thrill to me. So thank you for having me. I'm going to very quickly screen share because I'd like to show you some slides and things. So let me see if I get this right. So my name's Doug Guthrie, as I think you heard, and I'll do a very brief introduction to myself. I've been, probably my first identity is as a China scholar, but I've kind of grown up in my life and in my career as also in the business school world. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about China and strategic market entry in China, but also leadership and how to help companies think about how to grow their leaders and how to become effective leaders within organizations. My original career was at NYU, and I was at the Stern School of Business. That's where David and I met each other. I then ran executive education there for a while, which is around the time that I met the founders of the Berlin School. And then I went off to be dean of a business school, the George Washington University School of Business, for a little while. And then I got a call from Apple, and they said, "Why don't you come work for us?" And so I said, under one condition: the only way I was going to work for Apple was if I could be in China. And so I spent about the last 5 years of my career with Apple in China, came back about a year ago, and now I'm a professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and I work very closely on some entrepreneurial ventures with David Slocum and Craig Marcus. So that's me, and thanks for having me. As Megan mentioned, this is a series, and we're thinking of it as a series, so I want to be able to give you guys as much as I can. I'm going to talk fast because I want to make this worth your while, but I also want to leave time at the end for some comments and questions and thoughts and anything you might have. So I'll try to finish around the 45 and just stop wherever we are, because even if I don't get through all of the points that we want to talk about, we're going to have plenty more time together in the coming weeks and months. I will just mention here that a lot of the stuff that I've developed here, it's been sort of a career of development of this kind of content. And so I've been working on this in this space for over 30 years. But I also have developed some different models and modalities of how to deliver it. So I often do these kinds of talks, but we also at Thunderbird have a virtual asynchronous version of it. And so there's lots of opportunities to get access to this content if you're interested in it. Generally, when I talk about these issues, I'm really focused on, in the last year, I've sort of been focusing on these 8 different categories of work where we talk about the history of China and the political economy of China, how to really think about supply chain and manufacturing in China, what China is about is an innovation economy, what it really means for the global economy today, how China's consumer ecosystem is transforming in really fundamental ways, technology and society. And then recently, I've also been talking about things like the trade wars and COVID-19. Today, I'm primarily going to focus on points 1 and 2, but if as we get to the question and answer period, if you have questions about any of these, I'm happy to talk about. China is my life's passion, and so I'm always happy to talk about whatever people are interested in. So let me dive in. I have some mostly slides that I'm going to talk through, but there's some collateral video that I enjoy showing. If we were together in an executive education classroom, we'd sort of spend time watching it and have a conversation thinking about it. We're going to be a little more rushed today, but just for a couple of minutes, I'd just like you to sort of sit back and think about some images that I'm going to show you and why they're so important for understanding where China is in the world today. So this is the first of these images. It lasts about 2 minutes, but I'd just love for you to think through what this means to you and what do you see? Okay, so if we had time to sort of fully debrief on that, I would want to ask you, what did you see? I'll just go through it quickly to highlight a couple of things that I hope you saw. The first thing that's really important that I always like to point out to executives who are studying China is just how long the history is. This is a country with about 5,000 years of history dating back to the Xia dynasty. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the world. Usually when I'm talking about China, I sort of go back to about 500 BC, but that's still about 2,500 years of history. And that history is important because not only does it span a long time, but it spans a lot of transformations for China. One of the things you might have noticed is that there were several moments where China created some of the greatest innovations in the world. For about 1,000 years, China was far and away the most powerful economy in the world, occupying about 1/3 of the global GDP, but it was also the most innovative economy in the world. Many of the innovations that the West took credit for later, they were actually invented in China. Things like the printing press and paper and gunpowder and the nautical compass. A lot of the things that transformed the world in the Renaissance era. These things were all invented in China. There was also a great crisis for China for many years in the years following the mid to late Ming dynasty, when the West became much more powerful. And then there was the world wars and the rise of communism, very dark period during communism as well. But then in 1979, China takes off in a new direction. And so 40 years ago, the Chinese economy was about 1/14 the size of the US economy. Shortly, within the next couple of years, probably 2026, China is going to become the largest economy in the world. If you count nominal GDP, it's probably 2026. If you count real GDP, which is just for purchasing power parity, China already is the largest economy in the world. So this is a dramatic rise from a country that was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1979 to over the next 40 years would become the most powerful economy and certainly one of the most powerful political players in the world today. And so my excitement and passion as somebody who lectures about these issues, is helping business people understand what all of that means. And make no mistake about it, the United States and China and Europe and China, we all need each other. We need to be in sort of a dynamic relationship in which we're all, because we're too economically and politically interdependent to not be. And so those are the kinds of things that hopefully jumped out for you. These are other images. You know, when I ask people what they think of when they think of China, some say the most populous nation in the world, the largest communist polity in the world, manufacturer for the world, a lot of pollution. To my mind, my favorite story is the one in the upper left-hand quadrant, which is actually the same picture that's a different view of the picture that's behind me. It is in many ways one of the most interesting economic development stories in the world. And again, in 1979, China was in a disastrous state. And 40 years later, it has just become a powerhouse economically and politically, and a powerhouse in models of economic development. And so these are the kinds of things that I like people to help people understand. Now, many people often think that China is a powerhouse economically because of the massive, deep, cheap labor pool. And that is true. It's one part of it. Having a floating population, a migrant labor force within your country of about 300 million people is a huge advantage. But that is a very small part of what's actually going on in China today. China is also far and away the most innovative country in the world, in my opinion. Now, there are many people in the United States and many engineers at Apple that I've worked with who would refute that. But I think if you look at things like smart manufacturing, supercomputing, high-speed rail, biotech, renewable energy, China is in many ways leading the world in a number of these different areas. And so it's just a powerful thing to think about. Now, I like to begin this story with the moment that I first arrived in Shanghai. I started studying Chinese maybe in the late 1980s, and finally, started to go do my doctoral research in Shanghai. And this picture of Shanghai, again, is the same spot as the one behind my shoulder. But this is what it looked like in 1994. And this is the reason that I think this is such an interesting and dramatic economic development story. And it's one that's not just got drama to it, but it's important to understand the economic models and what they mean for doing business in China today. So within 25 years, we've seen that desolate area be transformed into a futuristic urban landscape in which 3 of the top 20 tallest buildings in the world all sit within 1 block of each other. Truly, truly a remarkable story of economic transformation. Now, all of that's great, and like that really sort of gives you the drama of the story. But for me, it's much more important if you want to do business in China, not to just be sort of wowed by the bright lights and the amazing economic development story, but to actually go a little deeper and understand what China's history is about. But that's not just sort of a language and literature and historians idea of what's interesting. That's also critical for business. If you want to deeply understand doing business in China today, you have to have a deep understanding of where China has come from and where it's going. So I want to take a brief, and I always feel a little silly when I talk about a brief history of China, because this is, again, a country of 5,000 years of history, or maybe we're going to talk about 2,500 years of history right now. But it's important for understanding culture. Now, typically when business people think about going to do business in China, they buy a book in the airport about Chinese culture, and they read a little bit about how you hold your name cards, or how you bow a little bit when you're at a table, or they maybe read about face or trust and relationships. In my opinion, forget about all this stuff. This is not the interesting question. If we think of culture as the deep-seated values, norms, and beliefs that shape the way people behave, I'm much more interested in historical moments. So whenever business people ask me, well, if I want to read about Chinese culture, which culture book should I read? I always sort of wave them off and say, forget about culture. Go by Jonathan Spence's The Search for Modern China, Jonathan Spence is a wonderful writer. It's a thick book, but it will help you understand where China has been, where it's going, and the drive that is central to how Chinese business people and politicians think about China today. So I like to talk about things like Confucianism, the Middle Kingdom, the century of humiliation, the communist era. These are the important things. I'm just going to go through these really quickly right now because I want to get onto some other substantive issues for you. But again, if you want to think about how do we understand this inscrutable place, Jonathan Spence, Search for Modern China. That's where I would start. Now, it's also important to realize that when we talk about these deep-seated issues, and some of them I'm going to mention very quickly right here, they are alive and well in China today. Too often do I see business leaders or politicians who are trying to negotiate within China, and they just don't understand how alive and well these deep-seated historical moments are. So Xi Jinping, for example, talks about Confucius a lot. He's, has a whole set of quotes that come directly out of Confucianism. And again, this is a long history. So what does that mean? And why is it even relevant? Well, Confucianism, if you go back to 551 BCE, is, it's a system of social order that is really built on harmony and self-mastery. And there's a whole set of things that we can't go into right now. But it is a system that sets up deep-seated cultural beliefs and social structures that really matter for interpreting China today. I also like to just cite history. For example, one of the things that's happening in Xi Jinping's China today, so Xi Jinping has been in power since 2013. There has been a spate of new laws and civil codes and lots of things that make it look like China is evolving into what we would call a rule of law society. Now, when we think of a rule of law society, we think of, capitalist economies like the United States or European economies, and we think of civil codes, and we think of laws, and we think of independent judiciaries that adjudicate those laws. Okay, so China's passing lots of laws. But going back to this individual on the left, Han Fei, he was a famous Chinese philosopher who made a very interesting distinction that is still alive and well in China today, which is the difference between rule of law versus rule by law. And the argument of Han Fei was, of course, emperors need laws. You need to tell people what to do. But these laws are not going to be independently adjudicated by courts. These laws are tools for authoritarian leaders to force people to do what you want them to do. And this is very, very common in China today. And there are lots of examples of this. When I was working inside of Apple and we were dealing with lots of new laws that were coming out, I would often have conversations with lawyers who would say, but how do we comply with this law? It just doesn't seem like it's possible for us to comply. And my answer, going back again to someone like Han Fei, is that's the point. You're supposed to be out of compliance. And the lawyers from the West would say, what do you mean? How does that make any sense? Well, the point is that law is set in place so you're out of compliance in order to force you to build relationships with local government officials so that you will do what they want you to do. And so this is a way of thinking that has 2,000 years of history in China. It's also really important when we think about what is the Chinese leadership thinking about and doing today. The Chinese leadership very much remembers this period when China was the center of the world. Indeed, the very word China means the Middle Kingdom, the central country. When China drew maps, China was always in the middle of a tributary system of nations. And, that was a very hallowed period. As I mentioned, this was a period that wasn't just about China being the biggest country or the most populous country. It was also the most powerful country economically. It was truly the center of the world. It was also among the most innovative economies in the world. As I mentioned, paper, textiles, the printing press, gunpowder, the nautical compass, many of the inventions that changed the world were developed in China. China was also far and away the most powerful military in the world. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he left the shores of Europe with 3 ships about 90 feet each, about 30 sailors on each ship. When Admiral Zheng He would typically set sail on his voyages, he would typically leave the shores of China with ships that were about 400 feet in length, maritime technology that Europe would not see for about 300 years. These ships would house about 400 sailors each, and they would typically sail the seas with an armada of about 24,000 people. And so it was just a very, very powerful and different kind of world. And this is the world and the way that China remembers itself. It's also interesting to note that that period was really defined by what we would think of as Admiral Zheng He's dominating the South China Seas and Africa and the Middle East, and also Marco Polo's Silk Road. And so it's just important to remember that this is how China thinks of itself. And this is where China plans on being, reclaiming its position as the most powerful economy and nation in the world. Now, starting the middle of the Ming Dynasty on for about the next 300 years, China, for odd historical reasons, had a turn inward. And it hurt China. It shaped its position in the global economy. During this time, we saw the Renaissance and the rise of mercantilism in Europe. Britain became a power in the seas. And eventually sort of China's broken heart culminated in what was the first Opium War, in which Britain went to war with China over the right to sell drugs, opium, in China. China lost that war. They were forced to pay reparations for it. And this was the beginning of what China refers to as, and Xi Jinping still talks about today, as the century of humiliation. So again, this historical context is really important when you're at a negotiating table, whether it's with government officials or high-level business partners. You know, these are among the things, the cultural touchstones that Chinese leaders remember. And so the period up to 1979, from 1924 to 1979, was a very dark period. It was marked by just humiliation at the hands of the West. Once Mao came to power, the communist era from 1949 to 1979 was also a horrible period. You know, if we think about what's happened in the United States or in the United States and Europe today, in terms of things like COVID-19, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have died. When Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, which was a way of reorganizing production and setting up communes and kind of transforming the way China operated, within 3 years, 50 million people had died of starvation. I mean, if you think about those numbers, 50 million people in a country died of starvation by 1962. And then, of course, there was the Cultural Revolution, and it was just a painful period for many Chinese people. And there are students that I've had in China who either grew up during the Cultural Revolution or their parents grew up and or were executed during the Cultural Revolution. So this is a period that's still present in China's memory. Now, the story changes in 1979. 1979 is a dramatic, transformative moment. Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1979. An interesting story about Deng Xiaoping. You know, when China was sort of regarded as a copycat economy, and it has been for much of the economic reforms, that's painful for Chinese people. Because again, people like to think of China as a great innovative nation. And so the idea is that China doesn't have any real innovators is painful. There was an interesting moment in, I guess it was 2014, when Walter Isaacson's book about Steve Jobs came out. And that book was widely translated and widely sold in China. And, you know, there was some angst among Chinese people, even in 2014, of like, when are we going to have our Steve Jobs? When are we going to have the people who transform the world? And there was a great article that was written during that time, which basically made the case that actually we already did have our Steve Jobs. His name was Deng Xiaoping. He saved China. And there, an interesting story about, an additional story about Deng Xiaoping. When he was 16 years old, he boarded a steamliner and went to study in France as a study abroad student. And when he was leaving, this is probably about 1921, when he was leaving, his father asked him, "Why are you going to France? Like, what is there for you?" And Deng Xiaoping said, as a 16-year-old, he said, "I want to go to the West and learn what has made the West powerful so I can come back and save China." And I just love that story because it's just sort of, it's a remarkable thing to think about what this young man, young boy was thinking about. And he rose to power. And he transformed China. Now, I generally like to think of China's economic reforms as built around these different epochs that are loosely tied to the leaders. So if you think about the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, it was kind of China was open for business, and we were going to, figure out how to transform China economically, socially, and politically. Heavy reliance on China's deep, cheap labor force and manufacturing. The 1990s are a period, this individual here is actually the premier of China during this time. His name is Zhu Rongji. He was the premier for part of the Jiang Zemin's reign. And they were really much more focused on moving beyond just deep, cheap labor and manufacturing, and instead then moving towards a system that really focused on attracting foreign investment in order to get technology, right? And so it was, the stuff, the issues that we hear going on today in terms of China stealing IP, or, the different dynamics about how different companies are entering China and what they need to do to be a part of the manufacturing supply chain in China. That stuff really began in the 90s. Now, in the 90s also, the United States was very active in keeping China out of the WTO, which meant that China could do whatever it wanted. In 2001, China's accession to the WTO occurred, and that occurred with a regime change to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And at that point, by international law, it became illegal for China to have extreme regimes of quid pro quo for market access. And so the 2000s, I generally think of as a much looser and more laissez-faire period, kind of like the Wild West. This was a time when foreign corporations could just go into China and do anything and just use the supply chain in any way they wanted and have access to the market in any way they wanted. All of that changed with the rise of Xi Jinping, and this is the era that we live in right now. So Xi Jinping was elected president in the fall of 2012. He was inaugurated on March 14th, 2013. And so we've been living in the era of Xi Jinping since then. And this is a very, very different era. Now, make no mistake about it. What we are witnessing under Xi Jinping, or what we have witnessed in the last 7 years, has been the most aggressive consolidation of power since Mao. But Xi Jinping is also a very, very intelligent capitalist. So I have been with too many foreign companies who sort of make this assumption that, like, oh, Xi Jinping's an authoritarian communist. He doesn't really understand the capitalist negotiations. That is a mistake. That is folly. Xi Jinping is a very, very smart capitalist and economic developer. And so they have created a system that has accelerated China's transition to rapid economic growth. However, Xi Jinping has done a better job at co-opting the private sector than his predecessors. And so there's a tight partnership in China today between the political situation and China's continued rise to become the most powerful economy in the world, and the situation of the relationship between the government and in particular the private sector. And so it's become it's something we should not underestimate, in my opinion. Now, there are 3 keys to economic reforms in China in this era that I often like to talk about. The first is pragmatism. Here again, if you sort of mislabel, or you can label China as a one-party authoritarian, even communist system, but make no mistake about it. Since Deng Xiaoping, Chinese leaders have been fundamentally pragmatic. Deng Xiaoping was always famous for saying, I don't care if a cat is black or white, I just care if it catches mice. And, that's sort of a cryptic and inscrutable thing to say. But the reason he would say it is he was trying to signal to people, I don't care about communism, socialism, capitalism, whatever. I just care about one thing, and that is China rising to its position as the most powerful economy in the world. So pragmatism is something that's very central to Chinese politics and to Chinese business negotiations. Second thing that's really interesting is gradualism. There are no economic models here. That's not quite right. There are economic models, but just like with pragmatism, there's no allegiance to any given economic model, whether it's private property or government regulation or anything else. All China cares about is the pragmatic approach to building a strong economy and building a strong nation. Now, that being said, China has been famous. Deng Xiaoping was also famous for this phrase, which is called 莫是过河, which means feeling for stones to cross the river. And the reason that's important is because, again, there are no clear models for what the economic development path is, but there's a lot of experimentation. And so what happens is that, all the leaders through the 5-year plans and 10-year plans understand where they need to go, but they are very much encouraged to experiment and figure out different economic models and approach to the standard economic growth. Now that gradualism is coupled with the third thing that I think is so important in China's economic reforms, which is decentralization. So here again, if we think about, well, how can China really compete with the West because in terms of economics, because it's not a capitalist economy. This is incorrect. China is a dramatically capitalist economy, but it's what I like to think of as local state capitalism. So China is a radically decentralized place, right? So there's there's the center in Beijing, but the country then is spread out into not just provinces, and provinces are sort of roughly like states. There are about 31 provinces in China. There's about 630 tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities. These cities are then built as municipalities, but they are divided up into districts. And then below them, there are townships and then villages. And all of these leaders of districts and townships and villages in China are essentially encouraged to run their districts like corporate CEOs. They have KPIs. These KPIs are very closely tied to everything that maps onto economic development. And if they don't achieve those KPIs, their careers will not advance. And so it's a very, very competitive system. One of the mistakes I see companies operating in China make all the time is they think, well, if our government relations team is doing their job well, they should have really good relations with the Beijing government, maybe the Shanghai government, the central government, these players. This isn't right. The correct thing in China is to understand that the real engine of economic growth are the districts, the townships, and the villages. And so, Shanghai, for example, is a very important city. The Shanghai municipal government is powerful, but Shanghai is a city of 15 district governments. And if you are a foreign company, you have to register in one of those district governments. And so your negotiations are not with the Shanghai government, they're with the local districts. Now, these aspects of decentralization and gradualism work together because they create this very competitive capitalist, local state capitalist landscape. Now, coming back to Xi Jinping, as I mentioned, we are witnessing one of the most aggressive consolidations of power in the last several hundred years in China. Xi Jinping is a very powerful player, and he has played his cards well. Now, what has that meant for foreign companies? Well, because of what Xi Jinping has wanted, a message has been sent out that you are not welcome in China unless you are helping China. So under Xi Jinping, we see a number of new laws like the labor dispatch system or the cybersecurity law. And both, basically, if you read carefully, these laws create this dynamic where it's very difficult for foreign companies to operate in China. That doesn't mean China doesn't want foreign companies there. It means a signal has been sent that you have to step up and participate in China along the lines with what the Chinese government wants. So from 2014, over the next several years, we saw new joint ventures announced with HP, Dell, Microsoft, IBM, Qualcomm, Cisco, Intel, and even Apple. And so these are very, very important economic and political dynamics in China, but they are fundamentally about technology transfer. Now, again, this is something that goes back to the 1990s, but this is a very interesting and complicated issue. So when we hear politicians like our former president saying things like, China is stealing our technology, this is incorrect. China is not stealing technology. However, China has created conditions where if you want access to the most robust manufacturing supply chain in the world, which is in China, and you want access to the largest market in the world, which is in China, you have to decide that you want to be a part of this system, okay? And so technology transfer becomes a key issue for every single company that wants to actually operate in China. Now, again, during the 2000s, this wasn't as much the case because Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao they didn't have the same vision of this that Xi Jinping had. We are back in this era today of technology transfer and technology capture. And if you are a foreign company, especially if you're a large foreign company and you're operating in China and local or central government officials don't have a sense that you're creating that benefit, you're not going to be welcome anymore. And so this has been a big change. We have some other things that I would like to talk about with China's consumer ecosystem, and I'll mention a few of them right now, and they will tee up our next conversation the next time we meet. But I do just want to highlight here that China's consumer ecosystem is a radically innovative and transformative ecosystem. And so, for example, one of the things I often like to cite, this is one of my favorite statistics in China, forgive me, but the data are a little out of date, but I think they're probably even more extreme today than they were when I was originally looking at this issue. But in 2017, the United States had about 43 billion in money that changed hands over mobile payments, right? And so, anything that's not cash and not credit cards, right? So stuff that's just operating over phones or over computers too, but in China, it's mostly over mobile payments over phones. In the case of China, if I was to ask you to guess what this number is, what would you say? I don't know, 10 times, 100 times? In China, at the same time period, mobile payments were operating at a clip of about 12.8 trillion. Now, you might think that that's impossible because how could it be? That's almost the size of the Chinese economy. That's the point. This is if you look at companies like Tencent and Alibaba and WeChat Pay and Alipay, these are the platforms that are going to challenge the big tech players of the world for dominance in transforming how economic transactions happen in the world. And so I'm going to stop right here because I want to just give us a little bit of time for comments or questions. But I want to end with another of my favorite videos, and then we'll take comments and questions. This is just to remind people that of the lack of cash in Chinese society. Even beggars on the streets usually have QR codes, and it's just sort of an interesting phenomenon. But let me show you one final video, and then we'll talk.
一天变2个，看出是没得去啊！这个跟那个还找那个还找师傅嘛，这个。我就是原来杀猪卖肉，我都没得师傅。 习近平。这个要说人勤快啊，想搞点钱啊，当然这个就喜欢做。朱大爷，他就是从开始卖被斗，他开始卖跟别个哈，别个那些他销售的不干得好，所以他长期他就一直教我，他觉得我们这些人对，我一直自己做生意，我是从96年开始做的，你看大概就是22年了已经都。现在的居民众啊哈，比原来我们那个时候做的居民众啊好得多，因为我们那个时候文化有限，不懂，网上就卖不来，就是靠自己的整嘛。这个卖呀，只是说把一家人生活靠起走。娃儿跟他媳妇那个样的，就开始淘宝高头卖了3年多4年了，在淘宝上卖的呀。当然说，就比我们现在这个门面上销售量大的那些。
这个网上数据看的话，就是订单稍微比较多的就是上海、北京、河北这一带。让我呢？
All right, I'm just going to pause right there and then wrap up with a few comments and then go into questions. But I don't know if that story arc makes immediate sense, but just think about this. So here's a guy, an individual, Grandpa 2, who makes 2 bamboo baskets a day. And he's a part of an entrepreneurial revolution that has happened in China since 1979. Before 1979, it was illegal to be a private entrepreneur in China. Today, there are more private entrepreneurs in China than there are people in the entire population of the United States or the EU. And these individuals have been relatively meager, lived relatively meager existences, hand to mouth, for many years of the economic reforms, but the convergence of big tech and small-scale entrepreneurs has transformed the lives of everybody. I don't know if you caught that last statistic, but this is a family that makes about 3 million renminbi a year, which is about $500,000 a year. They live in a county that has a per capita GDP of about $8,000 a year. And so because of the intersection and the exhortation of the central government of building up entrepreneurial spirit and the intersection of big tech through companies like Alibaba, which is the host of Taobao, the largest e-commerce system in China, it's created just a dramatic transformation in the way people live in China. And so I'm going to come back to these topics and more in subsequent sessions, but I want to pause right here so we just have time for questions and reflections before we go. So let me stop here for a minute. And I would love to hear any thoughts, questions, or areas of interest. And I can answer any questions that we have time for, but this can also help shape subsequent sessions that we'll do together in the coming weeks and months.
Doug, you did get a question come in through the chat window from someone, from Jorgendra. You have defended copycat culture, your expression. Are there effective IP regulations? What is the situation of tax laws and financial accounting integration with the IFRS?
So, okay, so very good question. And just to be clear, not sure that I would use the word defended copycat culture, but copycat culture is first a very real thing. And it preceded Deng Xiaoping, but there was a movement that was called the Shanghai movement, which literally in Chinese means mountain stronghold. And Deng Xiaoping in the 80s sort of encouraged this idea, which was that China needed to dig itself out of a deep political and economic hole that it was in. And, just like the Meiji oligarchs did in the 1860s on in Japan, there was a very clear approach to, well, we need to study what the West is doing, learn it, and copy it, and then refine and innovate beyond it. And so it is 100% true that that existed, but in my view, it's also 100% true that China has grown out of it. It is not just a copycat culture today. It is a culture that has grown and become much more innovative through imitation and then refinement. Okay, so that's a first point. The second point is there are major IP issues here. So China is now officially a part of the Paris Convention, and so it should be the case that when China steals technology, as it has in the case of, say, the Huawei and Cisco and Huawei and Motorola cases in the 2000s, it should be held accountable. Now, the thing that is complicated today, and this is where I get nervous when politicians and negotiators over intellectual property talk about China stealing intellectual property. What China has done today is that they've made it very clear, particularly under Xi Jinping, that entering China means you have to participate in the growth of China's economy. And for the most part, Chinese leaders have created a legal system in which you have to do that. But those technology transfer issues now don't happen through stealing. They happen through negotiations because companies like Apple cannot afford to not be in China. And so, and same with Tesla, and same with, there's a lot of companies that have set up major ventures in China. And, for myself, I was a part of some of these negotiations in which I would be advising companies, and they would say, well, can we just do this without giving any technology up? And the answer is, you can leave. You don't have to be here. But these companies make so much money in benefiting from China's supply chain and in benefiting from China's market, they choose to give what they can. And so it's a very complex system, but it's too simple to say that China's stealing IP. It is the case that China has negotiated aggressively for a lot of these outcomes, and foreign companies have decided it's worth it to their bottom line to stay. Now, with respect to tax laws and international accounting, again, very complex systems. I think Chinese people would argue that they are, playing on the up and up based on what Chinese laws are. And then foreign companies have a choice. Do they want to be there or not? And most of the companies that I've dealt with have decided it's, if you think about a company like Apple, Apple controls about 30% of the smartphone market share in the world. They capture about 90% of the profits in that market segment in the world. And that's not because their phones are just so much better than Huawei phones. It's because of how they are able to manage the supply chain. And there's just nowhere else for companies like that to go. And so it's a very, very complex system. And hopefully that helps answer your question. The second question, what are they making with this transfer? Are they building the company that beat the former owner of the technology? It's a good question. And, if I just take a case like the one I know the best, which is Apple, Apple has done a great job at managing the supply chain in China. And it's very, very powerful in terms of how well they do that. And for the most part, I think they think of themselves as participants in the Chinese economy. They're the Chinese market. Apple shares are up right now because iPhone 12s are selling so well in China. And they protect themselves pretty well. But you can't, when you have like this ecosystem of suppliers and all of these components sort of flowing into the system, you're going to get imitation. That's how markets work. And so so you end up having a situation in which companies have to decide what they want to do. And so for China, they're very interested in this issue of technology transfer, and they very much want the technology transfer to be a part of what they observe, and whether that's explicit technology transfer agreements, or if it's just more imitation in the marketing supply chain and the manufacturing ecosystem, they'll do it. And so that's just how they, that's just how those manufacturing supply chains work. And again, one of the things that's so powerful about China's manufacturing supply chain is it's an integrated system. And so that's why it works so well, both to producers who are using that supply chain, but also to the Chinese leaders who want to control the supply chain. And so there's another question. I have a feeling that we're always talking about China using Western mindsets and bias. Do they do the same? How do they see the rest of the world? That's a great question. And as a China scholar, I think I've observed a similar thing, Daniel, and I try very hard to help executives see that it's not appropriate to just assume that we understand how Chinese people think. And it's why I'm such an advocate of understanding history and just how Chinese culture and sort of mindsets have been shaped. But to your point, I do think we live in sort of these binary worlds. Like we live in a world in which, a lot of people in the West think Chinese people are like this, and a lot of people in China think Western investors and business people are, a different way. And so I think it's important to kind of try to break through that. I think we're all better business people and better politicians and better citizens if we try to move beyond those binary dynamics. Okay, Daniel said, sorry, another one. That's totally okay. I love questions. And so what is happening with this huge tension between the government and the owners of companies like Tencent? It's a very good question. Tencent is a little bit flying under the radar screen right now, but we should make no mistake about the fact that it's coming for them. The big player right now in the tension between big tech and China is Alibaba. Some people think that Alibaba is is in trouble right now because of Jack Ma's speech in early November. I believe it was November 3rd. And he gave a very widely publicized speech that was critical of the regulations of the Chinese banking system. And it may be the case that the Chinese government was just annoyed, and they sort of smacked him down a little bit and said, you don't get to do that, not in China. That particular incident, by the way, cost Jack Ma personally about $3 billion because it put on hold the IPO of Ant Financial. And so that was a very, very big moment. My own view is that this is not just about Jack Ma offending the government. And this is why I think Tencent is going to be involved with this as well. Because the issue here at stake here is not just the fact that Jack Ma was just getting too big and too powerful and thinking he could criticize the Chinese government. The issue is about the regulation of fintech. And so, and this is actually, by the way, something that the United States is going to have to face too. It's just that China can regulate things much more aggressively and quickly than US regulatory systems can. But the issue here is really, are fintech companies going to be regulated the way banks are? And that's a big question. And it's a question everybody should consider, remembering the mortgage crisis and the financial crisis that ensued in 2008. The questions of how new economic models are going to be regulated is incredibly important. Georgendra asks, most modern economies have thrived on two factors: one, capitalism, and two, democracy. While China has embraced capitalism, but they're way too low on democracy. Maybe the alternative is working, but what is the meaning of economic growth without democratic values and freedom of expression to citizens? So very, very good question. And this is a big debate amongst political scientists today. Liz Economy, who's one of my favorite Chinese political economists, wrote a book about Xi Jinping a couple of years ago. And there's been a number of other books that have come out that have asked exactly this question. If 9 out of the top 10 economies in the world are essentially democratic capitalist systems, how is it that the soon to be largest economy in the world is decidedly not a democratic capitalist system? It is a capitalist system, but it's clearly an authoritarian system, and it's one that's becoming more authoritarian. Now, here's the interesting thing for me, and I'm not a defender of China because I think a lot of the things that China has done in places like Xinjiang and what's happening in Hong Kong and what could happen in other parts of China are a little scary. They're very real things to understand. The interesting thing for China, though, is, and I believe this, I believe that China, ironically, understands certain aspects of capitalist development better than, people in the United States, my own country, like to think of themselves as the greatest capitalists in the world, right? This is the place where de Tocqueville wrote about capitalism in America. Actually, I think if you really want to understand economic growth and sustainable economic growth, you have to really think carefully about local economic development and the ways in which public-private partnerships work together. China's doing this better than anywhere else in the world, as far as I know. I think Germany has done it very well, but Germany is a much smaller economic base and smaller manufacturing base than China. But this is one of the reasons when political leaders have asked me questions about the trade war, my answer is always, there's no way that the United States wins a trade war with China. It's not even going to be close. And partly that's because of how there's this alliance between the central government, local governments that have a lot of autonomy, and the private sector. So do we have time for one more, Megan, or one last one?
Why not? Of course.
Okay. So you could transfer technology, but most of the world is now ruled by software and the platforms you use to connect with users, like App Store. Do you think we will soon see an open ecosystem in China, one that West users can jump onto? Short answer, Daniel, no. There is a very clear kind of allegiance and connection between the central government in China and the platforms that they run. These companies like Alibaba and Tencent would like to go global. And so, there is the aspiration, but it's very clear, at least in my mind, that they're going to do it hand in hand with the government. And so as we see China's pivot away from places like the United States, the interesting thing that's happening right now is the Belton Road Initiative, which is China's Marshall Plan. And they are building a very strong ecosystem throughout Southeast Asia and Africa and the Middle East. But the interesting thing that is going to happen here is also, or the interesting thing to watch is also China's new deal with the EU. I think the trade war has really damaged US-China relations, and China has now started to pivot towards the Belt and Road Initiative and towards Europe. And here is where I think we're going to start to see some of those platforms start to open up more, but it's going to be a very close alliance. They're not going to open up and everybody can just jump on. It's going to be a very close alliance between China and the governments that it's working with. All right. Thank you, guys. These were great questions.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And someone just asked if it was available for download later. And yes, by all means, we will send you a recording within the week and a version of this presentation. And yeah, we hope you join us for the next session of Doug's Doing Business in China, as well as David's session 2 coming up on the 11th of February. So yeah, stay tuned, follow us on our social channels, and yeah, happy that you were able to make it.
Thanks for all, Doug. It was so interesting.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
All right, cheers.